The venerable Palatine Chapel in the German city of Aachen is packed with nobles and princes from all across the continent.
Its golden ceiling glitters in the reflected sunlight of a bright summer day. The year is 1376.
It's sweltering hot outside, but the air in the chapel is cool, pleasant, and full of anticipation.
The new king of the Romans will be crowned today, but this will be no ordinary coronation.
And its consequences will change the fate of Europe for decades to come.
The Archbishop of Cologne, not even 30, yet adorned in full priestly regalia, asks the ceremonial questions, and his voice resonates among the vaulted arches and the magnificent dome.
Will you maintain the laws of the empire? Will you maintain justice? Will you show due submission to the Pope?
I will, answers the young boy, barely 15 winters old, who is to be a king.
He then sits atop the ancient marble throne of great Charlemagne.
Accepts the scepter, the sword, the ring, the orb, and finally, the crown.
Fiat! The roar of his new subjects echoes through the chapel.
The eyes of the new king scan the assembled crowd of nobles and dignitaries.
Their faces seem uncertain, apprehensive, as if they weren't sure whether to take this all seriously. As if they already knew that their new monarch would plunge the realm into chaos and bloodshed.
The only face beaming with hope, merriment, and pride belongs to the guest of honor.
Charles IV, the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire and the most powerful man in all of Europe.
Usually, the king of the Romans is crowned after the death of the old emperor, the first step towards imperial coronation in Rome itself. Usually, the king and the emperor are one person. But there's nothing usual about this.
The young king's name is Wenceslas of Bohemia. The emperor is his father, and against tradition, he just let his son be crowned while he was still alive. By doing this, Charles wanted to ensure the survival of his legacy. It was meant to be his masterstroke, a crowning achievement, empowering his house for ages to come.
But it was a terrible mistake.
Wenceslas will never become emperor. He will be stripped of his kingship, and Europe will burn. My name is Vasek.
And I am Elżbieta.
And this is Bloody Heart of Europe.
In 2005, during a television poll, the people of the Czech Republic voted for the greatest person in their nation's history. They overwhelmingly chose Wenceslas's father, Emperor Charles of the House of Luxembourg. The reasons were quite obvious. If you ever visited Prague and walked along its streets, the lasting impact of this great monarch is visible to this day. Charles founded one of Europe's oldest universities and built a famous bridge bearing his name. He continued building the lavish St. Vitus Cathedral and founded Prague's new town. He ruled the Kingdom of Bohemia, a realm roughly corresponding to modern-day Czechia, and during his reign, Bohemia prospered. But that wasn't his only achievement. Charles was also the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, an overarching realm of which Bohemia was only a part.
The Holy Roman Empire was the most powerful political body in Europe. But it was also a bit weird when compared to other kingdoms of the day. For starters, it was absolutely huge. It encompassed today's Germany, Austria, Czechia, Switzerland, parts of Poland, Italy, France, and the Balkans. If your European geography isn't up to scratch, that is almost 2 times the territory of Texas. How could the emperors manage to rule over such a vast expanse of land when news, messages, and people could move at the speed of a horse and no faster? In short, the supposed country was actually fragmented into semi-independent kingdoms, duchies, and counties that sometimes listened to their emperor and cooperated against external enemies, but just as often rebelled or waged war against one another.
By all accounts, running this strange land was a bureaucratic nightmare. And to make matters even more confusing, the imperial succession was a bit of a mess as well. Instead of the tried and tested, my eldest son inherits the throne after me, the emperor was elected, not democratically by the will of the people, of course, but by a select few noblemen and priests, powerful men who often looked to their own profit first and foremost. Instead of choosing the best candidate, they could deliberately elect a weak man who could be easily controlled. Bribery and corruption were also an option for an ambitious nobleman who wished to wear the imperial crown.
As a ruler of the empire, Charles of Luxembourg was something of an oddity. Whereas some of his predecessors were rendered completely impotent in the face of inner strife, politicking, and backstabbing, Charles managed the demands of the job extremely well. In fact, he became a true giant of European history. During his reign in the 14th century, he brought peace, stability, and progress to the realm. He was a shrewd diplomat and a talented manager, always on the move, visiting far-flung corners of the empire to keep the bickering kingdoms and duchies together. And when he rested in Prague, which he made the capital of his realm.
He succeeded in everything he set out to do, except for one thing. Across 2 marriages, he could not produce a male heir to the throne, at least not one who could survive to adulthood. It was his 3rd wife, Anna of Schweidnitz, who finally gave him a healthy son. The emperor was 45, hardly a young father by today's standards, an old man in his time. After all, his father died at the age of 50, his grandfather aged 40, but nothing could spoil such a precious moment. You can feel Charles's joy across the centuries, most palpably from the letters he sent to people across his kingdom. Quote,
"All Bohemia, together with the surrounding countries, rejoice at the great happiness that has befallen you. You rich and poor, young and old, one as well as the other, rejoice. We have a son. Rejoice, dear faithful ones. He relieves you of the fear of seeing our royal tree dead, and thus the kingdom brought to ruin. We have a prince. The noble day of his birth was a glorious day for us. His coming was like the rising of the dawn that drives away the mist. At last, we have a prince."
End quote. The young heir's name was Wenceslas, and he was his father's most ambitious project. Charles wanted to create a lasting, stable version of the empire, and he had a brilliant idea how to do it. What if the King of Bohemia and the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire were always the same man? Then it would finally become a true united country with the seat of power in Prague.
Wenceslas was a key component in his father's master plan. He would become the first undisputed successor. He would show the empire that petty squabbles were not necessary. He would carry on his father's torch and build a strong dynasty of House Luxembourg that would lead Europe to prosperity.
But the clock was ticking for the emperor who, remember, was way past his prime. Charles saw old age knocking at the door, and he knew he had to start immediately. If it meant caution would be thrown to the wind, so be it.
Even before he celebrated his first birthday, the baby Wenceslas became a part of the realm's upper management. It sounds completely ridiculous, But the first official document signed in Wenceslas's name came just 5 months after his birth.
It was supposed to show the world that the son and the father were equal rulers from the very beginning. But that wasn't enough for Charles. The man who was famous for his strategic thinking began to use reckless, drastic measures, such as when 2 years later he crowned his son a king.
It was an absurd idea. Wenceslas was just an infant at the time, and Charles, the actual king, was alive and well. It meant breaking the coronation rite, but no rules seemingly applied to Charles or his firstborn.
In the beginning of the episode, we already talked about the unprecedented imperial coronation in the German city of Aachen, which would come 13 years after. But the first step on that road was made here, when a toddler became the King of Bohemia.
Picture the scene. A small child in full regalia, unable to correctly repeat the Latin phrases, the crown much too big for his head. According to one harsh chronicle, Wenceslas was crying the whole time and even defecated all over the holy altar. It was far from the sacred ritual it was supposed to be. Obviously, many powerful people found it highly disrespectful, but in the end, they didn't dare to challenge the emperor.
The 2-year-old Wenceslas was, therefore, a king. Of course, he didn't have any true power. His father decided everything, and yet, despite the lack of real responsibilities, the young heir wasn't allowed to have a normal childhood. To create a veneer of authority, Charles involved Wenceslas in all the kingly activities. He was sending his son on diplomatic missions abroad, made him preside over the Bohemian Provincial Assembly, appointed him the head of the tribute ceremonies. Wenceslas couldn't possibly understand what was happening around him. Every single decision he supposedly made was prepared in advance by others.
Wenceslas was growing up in his father's unescapable shadow, unable to form his own path. His formal education didn't help. From an early age, he was surrounded by tutors, 2 successive archbishops of Prague. You can imagine what that was like. Serious, religious old men who accentuated virtues such as humility and always listening to a power greater than yourself. They would be dull lessons for an adult, let alone a little boy who just wanted to chase other kids in the garden. But it didn't matter. Young Wenceslas had a royal seal to play with, instead of toy horses.
When Wenceslas was 7 years old, another son was born to Emperor Charles, Prince Sigismund. You might expect that Charles would now divide his attention between both his sons, that he would perhaps stop trying to control every single aspect of Wenceslas's life. But that didn't happen. From the very beginning, Sigismund was an afterthought in the mind of the great emperor. After all, Charles already had his firstborn, his God-given crown prince. So the royal charade continued without change.
When Wenceslas turned 15 years old, he legally became an adult. He should have been ready to rule by now. His father's overwhelming attentions should at least have succeeded in preparing him for what was to come. But it soon became clear that Wenceslas was not ready at all.
The reality was that all the lessons and experiences of rulership were just for show. Wenceslas's signature was proliferated on royal charters, but the young king didn't even have his own office or clerks. He presided over assemblies all over the country, but did nothing more than observe the proceedings. And when Charles's army went into battle, he made sure that Wenceslas arrived too late to take part in the fighting, but just in time to win some glory for himself.
All this undeserved success made Wenceslas believe his own hype. He was, or would soon be, the most important man in Europe. He ruled a kingdom since he was a baby, and he never encountered any problems he couldn't fix. Yes, his father may have helped here and there, But without him, Wenceslas would surely manage just fine.
He must have felt pretty confident that hot summer day in Germany we already talked about in the very beginning of the episode. The day of the unprecedented coronation. The day when the 15-year-old became the king of the Romans, or the king of the Germans. You can encounter both terms in the history books, and they mean the same thing, the ruler of the Holy Roman Empire.
But how did we even get there? What made the lords and nobles of the empire accept this Nepo baby as their new king? Plainly speaking, money did. The election of Wenceslas was made possible by a whole lot of bribery, underhanded machinations, and concessions by Emperor Charles.
Remember, the position of the king of the Romans was not hereditary. A ruler had to be elected by a collection of high-ranking nobles and priests. Among the potential candidates would be various dukes and counts of the empire, all powerful men in their own right. So if the slowly ailing Charles wanted to secure his son's succession to the imperial throne, he had to be smart about it.
He needed votes, so he resorted to buying them. The plan was simple. There were many powerful cities in the empire, rich, influential, and in possession of special rights and privileges. But Charles needed the support of the nobility, not the merchants. So he transferred those privileges to the princes, who would in exchange vote for Wenceslas. Smart, easy, painless. Just the kind of strategic ploy the emperor was famous for.
So it seemed at that time anyway. The scheme did work and Charles got what he wanted. But in the long run, it proved far too clumsy. It alienated the cities whose commerce was the lifeblood of the realm. Throughout his life, Charles tried to promote stability and internal peace in the empire. But with this gambit, he shattered that stability. Without even realizing it, he committed a devastating strategic error. He wouldn't personally be bothered by it. By the time the consequences struck, the emperor would be long dead. So, the mistakes of the father would have to be paid for by the son.
1 year after Wenceslas's German coronation, Charles was ailing fast. The 61-year-old emperor probably suffered from gout, which made his joints into sources of constant pain. In spite of his illness, he accompanied his beloved son to France for one last voyage. This was a much more impressive feat than it sounds. By this time, Charles was extremely frail for such a draining journey. To illustrate how poor his health was at this time, Charles wanted to see holy relics at the top of a cathedral tower in Paris, but there was no way he could reach them on his own. So, the great emperor whose word ruled Europe had to be hauled up the stairs like a sack of turnips.
It may seem undignified, but it tells you something important about Charles. The old emperor was always on the move, always charging forward, even when his body couldn't sustain it any longer. The strength of his will, determination, and stubbornness were stunning. And they were the exact qualities his heir lacked the most.
A year later, the inevitable happened. The mighty emperor was finally betrayed by his own body. He died of pneumonia at the age of 62. We can only guess what went through Wenceslas's head when he followed his father's coffin through the streets of Prague. He had just lost his second parent. His mother died years earlier, and now his father, who always watched over him, was gone as well. He must have felt very young and very lonely, in spite of the hundreds of his father's knights and nobles in the magnificent funeral procession.
Charles left both the Kingdom of Bohemia and the Holy Roman Empire to his son. And what seems clear to us in retrospect quickly became apparent to the rest of Europe as well. The 17-year-old Wenceslas was not up to the task.
Let's be clear in one respect. The task wasn't easy. and to live up to the previous emperor was barely possible. Charles was a rarity, a man of unquestionable talent, intelligence, and charisma. What's more, his upbringing, so much harsher than the one he prepared for his son, made him resilient, realistic, and focused on his goals. He possessed an innate ability to do everything by himself, to micromanage the empire through every nook and cranny of European politics. Solving the realm's issues was something akin to a fun puzzle for him. But he wasn't able to transfer these qualities to his son.
Even if Wenceslas had been more like his father, the situation he found himself in at the beginning of his reign would still be deeply troublesome. The nobility didn't really respect him. He was drowning in debt from all the bribery Charles had to do to get him elected. The cities, which were stripped of their privileges by the old emperor, weren't happy. Their wealth could pay for whole mercenary armies, and they threatened war over their lost advantages.
Looking beyond the borders of the empire, Wenceslas didn't have any obvious allies. Other important European monarchs were busy fighting the 100 Years' War. Europe still felt the ramifications of the Black Death plague epidemic that killed millions. And the whole continent was spiritually torn apart by the papal schism, which saw two competing popes trying to rule Christendom.
Wenceslas tried to put all those fires out. He attempted to continue his father's policies. He traveled frequently. He cared about the realm. He called together a grand assembly of the imperial nobility, but soon found out that barely anybody would come, so he cancelled the event. Disappointed, but undeterred, he organized another meeting. This time, the noblemen did grace the monarch with their presence, but the proceedings descended into chaos. Arguments broke out among various attendees. No one could agree on anything. The king's efforts to restore a semblance of order were ignored. Something like that would be utterly unthinkable when his father was still on the throne.
The times were dark and dangerous, and it's worth mentioning that Wenceslas did more or less succeed in maintaining the king's peace in the empire. He also managed to marry his sister, Anne of Bohemia, to Richard II, the King of England. Wenceslas thus gained a valuable ally. Still, barely avoiding wholesale civil war and arranging a single profitable marriage, those weren't the glorious achievements you'd hope for from the heir of the great Charles.
The international situation regarding the church wasn't much better. Wenceslas staunchly supported the Pope in Rome against his rival in the French city of Avignon. But the rest of Europe stayed divided on the issue. Even Wenceslas's people, the Czechs of Bohemia, wouldn't fall in line. The king's own cousin, a powerful nobleman, Jost of Moravia, who will become very important to this story later on, stubbornly clung to the Pope in Avignon.
What's more, the Roman Pope, through his loyal Archbishop of Prague named Jan of Jenstein, started trying to control Wenceslas, to dictate what the king should or shouldn't do, instead of being an equal ally. In time, this would drive Wenceslas away from the Pope, and the Archbishop Jenstein would become the king's mortal enemy.
Then there was the situation with the title of Emperor. Wenceslas already ruled the Holy Roman Empire, yes, but he ruled it under the less prestigious title of the King of the Romans. To be crowned emperor would grant him no additional territory or significant powers. Still, it would come with a whole lot of new dignity and gravitas, extremely useful for a young, untested ruler. Wenceslas knew he needed the support of his nobles in order to win the imperial crown. And if he got the crown, perhaps he would also gain their respect. But they wouldn't let him be crowned without respecting him first. Wenceslas's dad would surely find a way out of this catch-22, invent a brilliant political strategy, divide and conquer the impudent princes. But he was gone now. The king was alone.
Year after year, he met with nothing but setbacks. It must have felt like repeatedly slamming your head against a wall. There are problems everywhere, but nobody listens to you, doesn't trust you to solve them. All your power turns out to be just an illusion. What are you supposed to do then?
Wenceslas slowly but surely gave up. Every intense negotiation, every dispute he was unable to settle, came with a heavy cost to the king's mental well-being. He would hide away in one of his castles, drink, hunt, have fun with his friends. Over time, the periods of Wenceslas's inaction grew longer and longer. Then, after half a decade of trying, he retreated back to the relative comfort of Bohemia. The vast realm of the Holy Roman Empire became almost an afterthought.
The inner circle around Wenceslas also changed drastically. The embittered king who couldn't be emperor became more and more dismissive towards his father's old advisors, and instead started surrounding himself with people he liked. These weren't experienced nobles like before. He spent his whole childhood with men like that. No, when he chose his own companions, he preferred men of lower status. Men who weren't bogged down in the world of complicated politics. There was a problem, though. Such people might be good for lifting your spirits, but they are certainly not the best help in managing an empire.
If you think this starts to sound like a recipe for disaster, you are absolutely right. Soon, even the Kingdom of Bohemia was seemingly too much to handle for Wenceslas. He more and more often completely disappeared from the public eye, instead spending an outrageous amount of time hunting wild game.
We have a preserved record that almost comically illustrates how bad things got in Bohemia. Bonifacio da Lupi, an Italian diplomat, wrote an account of his journey to negotiate a signature on important documents. He was sent to visit the king, but the king was nowhere to be found. In fact, almost no one from the royal council was present in Prague. Instead, they were lounging in a countryside castle and admitting no visitors. The king was so serious about the rule that he even burned down houses around the castle, so that potential visitors would have nowhere to be accommodated. And when Bonifacio insisted he had to see Wenceslas, one of the king's noble friends asked him for a significant bribe.
The diplomat did eventually get to see the king, after weeks of delay. But Wenceslas was interested in one thing and one thing only. Did the Italians bring some fancy hunting weapons with them? Bonifacio left Bohemia completely exasperated at the state of imperial affairs.
The whole situation reads like a comedy, and the picture it paints is stark. After just a few years of ineffectual rule, Wenceslas turned into a disinterested, disillusioned king, unwilling to even try anymore. Sometimes he sent delegations to negotiate in his name. Other times, he gave up important positions just so a problem would go away. If you rule a massive country full of power-hungry nobles, such weakening of your authority is bound to have consequences. Wenceslas will find out the hard way when he gets thrown in a prison cell.
But we are getting ahead of ourselves. For all of Wenceslas's many faults, he still retained a modicum of respect. To lose it, he would have to do something truly outrageous, something that would shock the nobles into action. Say, personally murdering an innocent priest.
You see, Wenceslas's disinterest in ruling didn't manifest only through boredom and apathy. He also lacked patience and was prone to fits of intense anger. This played a huge role during the king's struggle with the Archbishop Jan of Jenstein, the loyal crony of the Pope in Rome. A struggle which culminated in a truly bizarre, scandalous confrontation.
The details of the conflict aren't important for our story. Suffice to say, the king and the archbishop had a long history of disagreements. It all came to a head with the appointment of an abbot without the king's approval. A seemingly minor issue was the last straw that left the king absolutely furious. And the way he reacted shattered his reputation across Christendom. We have a detailed account of the whole exchange because the archbishop later complained about it to the pope. First, the king wrote an angry letter. Quote,
"You, archbishop, return to me the castle of Rodnice and my other castles, and depart from my Bohemian land. If you attempt anything against me or my people, I intend to drown you and remove the strife. Come to Prague."
End quote. Curiously, despite the threatening nature of the king's message, Jan of Wienstein did come to Prague, and he regretted his decision very soon. He found the king drunk and in an apoplectic state. Wenceslas screamed insults in the archbishop's face, threatened to cut off his head, and then ordered the guards to arrest Jan and his delegation. According to the archbishop, the king then once again succumbed to his obsession with drowning people. By the way, this is less weird than it sounds. In medieval times, drowning was considered an appropriate punishment for a fallen priest. Still, it had to be absolutely terrifying for Jan and his friends. Quoting the archbishop,
To the others the king threatened, "I will drown you and you." When I knelt down before him several times, seeking to appease his anger, he also mockingly knelt down before me on both knees.
End quote. The archbishop managed to escape in the confusion, but the rest of his delegation weren't as lucky. They were taken in for questioning. It took hours, but the priests didn't give the king the answers he wanted, which only made him more furious. Still drunk, he decided to subject 2 of them to intense torture. He had them put on the rack and then had their toes crushed with a thumbscrew. Then, in a truly insane turn of events, the king of the Romans decided to join in personally. He took a torch and burned the sides of his bound prisoners until their skin was marred with blisters.
After grueling hours of torture, the king grew tired and also finally sobered up. Slowly, he realized what he had done. Even a king cannot torture priests in a dungeon and evade consequences. So he tried to pressure his prisoners to promise not to tell anyone what happened in exchange for their freedom. Some agreed, but he couldn't convince them all. The vicar John of Nepomuk didn't survive the brutal torture. The king reacted in a fashion of a true mob boss. He had his men dump the corpse in the river, bound in a hog tie so it wouldn't float. But the truth couldn't stay hidden now. John of Nepomuk would eventually become a saint of Bohemia for his martyrdom, and Wenceslas would be known as the king who murdered a priest.
Now, we are not quite certain how much of this is accurate. After all, our primary source is Jan of Wienstein, a man with a vested interest in seeing the king discredited. But we know that John of Nepomuk did die of torture, and that his corpse did bear signs of burning. Whether Wenceslas was personally present or not, the whole episode became a horrible scandal that made many powerful people deeply angry at their king. This, coupled with Wenceslas's failure to rule effectively, meant that the pressure cooker was finally ready to explode.
Thus, in the 16th year of Wenceslas's reign, when the king was 33 years old, the League of Lords was born. Some of the oldest noble houses in Bohemia banded together, decided to take matters into their own hands, and rebelled. Often, when nobles rise against their king, they aim to depose him and replace him with someone else. But this was not the case here. The rebels wanted to cut the king down to size, sure, but they also wished to keep him on the throne.
One of their most important objectives was instead to remove the petty nobles Wenceslas surrounded himself with, and to install themselves into positions of power next to the king. They thought that given the chance, they could control Wenceslas and make him do their bidding.
It's always a risky business rebelling against your liege lord, and the repercussions could be lethal if the enterprise failed. But the League of Lords succeeded, and it succeeded in a spectacular fashion. The lords with their soldiers lay in wait for Wenceslas while he traveled through the countryside with his retinue, catching them unawares in an ambush. The king surrendered without a fight. The rebels then took the king back to Prague Castle, imprisoned him there, and presented him with their demands, including more power in the hands of the nobility. The king must have been horribly shaken by the speed and suddenness of the events, especially as one of the chief rebel lords was his cousin, the aforementioned Jost of Moravia. He caved almost immediately, signing everything the rebels wanted. They stayed true to their word and let him go.
Wenceslas was free again, but politically weaker and enormously embarrassed in front of the whole of the empire. The positions of power near the throne were filled with traitors, including those of the king's own family. Other rulers might have tried to get vengeance, to execute their captors, to gain back what they had lost. Not the tired, confused king of Bohemia. He just slinked back to a hunting retreat with his tail between his legs and drank the days away.
If Wenceslas ever reflected on the successes of his reign thus far, it probably didn't make for a very happy contemplation. He wore the crown of a king, but the emperorship was as unreachable as ever. He didn't father a son to inherit his realm. He hadn't solved the papal schism. The empire was fractured and viciously insubordinate. In short, the God-given prince failed to live up to his father's legacy. You might argue that his father failed him first, that Wenceslas's upbringing was ill-conceived and counterproductive. But does any of that really matter? The reality was that the king was useless, and everybody knew it.
You might reasonably think that it just couldn't get any worse for Wenceslas. But these were not reasonable times. A much more devastating family betrayal lurked just beyond the horizon. Do you remember Wenceslas's brother Sigismund, the boy who grew up in the shadow of his older sibling, unloved and unnoticed by his illustrious father? Well, the boy is now a man and a king in his own right. And he will stop at nothing to achieve his ultimate ambition, to become the greatest monarch of the age.
Hey everyone, it's Alžběta and Vašek.
We hope you enjoyed our first episode. Next week, we will be releasing a bonus episode where we dive into all the details that didn't make it into the main episode.
If you don't want to wait, or if you'd like to support us, you can find us on Patreon as Bloody Heart of Europe. That is patreon.com/Bloody Heart of Europe podcast, where you'll get access to even more exclusive content.
Since we are just a team of two, we truly appreciate any support.